It's been an interesting month, full of economic news. Recently, the US inflation figures spooked the markets as there was no sign of underlying inflation abating. Then back home here, Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe warned that a deteriorating global economy would make it harder for Australia to achieve that soft landing that we're all hoping for, and that's due to the economic buffeting that's underway. Now, in his annual appearance before the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics, boy, that's a long term, Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe explained the Reserve Bank wouldn't be deterred from more interest rate rises. In fact, he expressed doubts that the 3.5% unemployment rate would be able to be maintained at the same time. And he mentioned he was worried that businesses are currently using inflation as a cover for even higher prices, which of course fuels inflation. And then he gave his views on the property markets. And even though he said he was not forecasting, as you'll hear in my chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson in a moment, boy, the media took it as forecast when he explained he wouldn't be surprised if house prices fell 10% from their peak. He also said the Reserve Bank wasn't to blame for housing affordability issues. In fact, he blamed the choices on you, on me, on society. Boy, there's a lot to unpack from Dr. Lowe's speech. So in today's show, I chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of my housing market, and we take you through what that means for our economy and our housing markets. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that apart from the podcast, once a week I have a regular Property Insider chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Australia's leading housing economist, on our YouTube channel. But today I want to play the audio of one of our recent chats here for you on this podcast. But before I do, I want to give you some context. Because over the last little while, the outlook for house prices and shares worsened because the expectation that interest rates are going to keep going higher for a while based on inflationary economic data from the United States has now spooked our markets a little bit. It seems that inflation is going to be harder to budge in the United States and here, and that was brought to light by Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe when he indicated that the Reserve Bank, is going to keep raising interest rates because they're probably not at neutral level yet. And they're not. We know that. Interest rates were dropped to wartime stimulatory levels, and the Reserve Bank is now bringing them up to close where neutral. In other words, where it's not stimulating the economy, but it's not slowing it down. And to slow the economy down, the Reserve Bank had to raise interest rates higher. It had to slow the economy down so we're not having inflation. But all this is spooking the market. You see, the Reserve Bank Governor appeared in front of the House, our politicians, the Economic Committee, and he very clearly communicated the view of the Reserve Bank that more interest rates are going to be needed in months ahead. Now, I don't think that really surprised anyone in the know, but Governor Lowe noted the general inflationary psychology appears to be shifting, and demand, which has been very strong relative to the ability for the economy to meet that demand, is also shifting. In other words, we are getting somewhere. And you'll hear in my chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson in a short while how that's turning out. Once again, Dr. Lowe repeated the case for a large interest rate rise is going to diminish the higher interest rates go, and he believes interest rates are going to be needing to get to a more normal level. He said that the 2.35 that currently is the cash rate of the Reserve Bank is on the low side. What this did, though, was affect the money markets. They priced in a bigger opportunity, a bigger chance of a 50 basis point official interest rate rise in October, and that the end result of interest rates are going to get to probably 3.95% by mid-2023. Now, we know the money markets have been wrong. They were suggesting even much higher rates only a few months ago, and now they've brought down their expectations. But Yes, as I said at the beginning, this is spooking the markets. And this has been a significant shift from a couple of weeks ago when the market only thought there was a really, really low chance that there'd be a 50 basis points rise in October and that at the end interest rates wouldn't get that high. Well, anyway, Dr. Lowe said to the committee that how high interest rates need to go and how quickly we get there is going to be guided by incoming data and the evolving outlook for inflation in the labour market. You're going to hear in my discussion with Andrew Wilson that in his speech to the House of Representatives Standing Committee, Governor Lowe said he wouldn't be surprised if house prices dropped by 10% because of higher interest rates. Now, he said that's not a forecast, but once it's out in the media, boy, a lot of people seeing that as a forecast. He also said the Reserve Bank wasn't to blame for housing affordability issues. He said it was made by choices. We're choosing to live in great accommodation in coastal cities and have land, not medium density developments. Now, I hear what he's saying. He also said inflation should come back towards 4% by the close of 2023 after peaking closer to 8% later this year. And the Reserve Bank also believes the cash rate is too low, as I said, and there's going to be a few further interest rate rises. Now, just getting back to houses, Dr. Lowe, who doesn't normally talk about real estate and property, said the fact that Australians have to pay high prices for houses isn't about interest rates over a long period of time. He said it's the choices we've made as a society that most of us have got high house prices. And those high house prices come not from high cost of construction. He said they come from high cost of land embedded in each of our dwellings. And why do we have a high cost of land? He said it's because of the choices we've made about taxation and the choices we've made about zoning and urban design. And the fact that most of us have chosen to live in fantastic cities on the coast and that we all want a block of land and that we don't want to live in high density accommodation and we've chosen to underinvest in transport so we all want to live in the same spots. Well, there's some truth in that, but you're going to hear Dr. Andrew Wilson's going to have a slightly different view. But if you're a regular to this podcast, that wouldn't surprise you. Now, when saying he wouldn't be surprised if Australian house prices fell by an average of 10%, Dr. Lowe said he thought house prices could fall, but it was unlikely that they're going to return to pre-pandemic levels, given how much prices have surged over the last couple of years. Yes, the property market is working its way through the normal cycle. Will prices drop as much as that? Well, that's a much more conservative view than a lot of the bank economists are suggesting. But interestingly, it wasn't that long ago that the Reserve Bank thought house prices could fall 15%. Who knows? Well, Dr. Andrew Wilson's got some views, and you're going to hear when I have my chat with him what his thoughts are there. But Dr. Lowe said that we're going to have to choose between some pain now, because he admitted that real wages aren't going to go up, or not doing anything to counter inflation, and that's going to create more pain down the track. Now, everyone's knocking the Reserve Bank, and to be fair, it's really been a difficult challenge for them. I believe they did the right thing by stimulating the economy and stopping us falling into the recession that other countries did during COVID. But the aftermath of COVID has created some really unusual circumstances, which makes it very difficult for them to get the monetary policy and growth and inflation equation right. Let's talk about that for a sec. First of all, the policy was forced to move so far away from those neutral levels where the Reserve Bank rates are that they don't stimulate the economy or they don't suppress it. It was forced to move so far away during COVID, and it meant that it actually needed a rapid move back to neutral levels. But there's always a lag when that happens. The banks haven't all passed on those increased rates, and it takes a while for them to flow through the community. So it is difficult for the Reserve Bank to calibrate what rates they should be using, that Goldilocks neutral rate. At the same time, the household sector in Australia accumulated around $275 billion in excess savings during the pandemic. We saved our money, we paid down our credit cards, we put money in offset accounts, and this means that households are more resistant to interest rate tightening now than in previous cycles. Again, this is making it harder for the Reserve Bank to know how high to put up interest rates. And the other factor is that due to the collapse in net migration during COVID and the pent-up demand following the reopening of our world when we got out of our COVID cocoons, labour markets are uncharacteristically tight at this stage of the tightening cycle. Normally around this time, there's fewer people with jobs. In other words, there's more unemployment, and therefore rising interest rates have a bigger effect. But that's not what's happening at the moment. So those three factors, the fact that Reserve Bank had to drop interest rates so low that they had to jump them up really quickly, the fact that we've got all these savings and we've all got a job, really just going to make it much more difficult for the Reserve Bank to get the interest rate setting right. But given the objective of the Reserve Bank is to short circuit, in their words, the inflationary animal spirits, it's clear that we're going to need further rate rises. And I don't know how high interest rates are going to go, but it seems like now the best policy would be to slow down the pace of tightening back to the 25 basis point increments that they have done in the past, and that would allow them time to assess the various forces. But it's going to be interesting to see what the Reserve Bank does. But in due course, and it could be early next year, inflation is going to peak, and around the same time, interest rates are going to peak. They're not going to raise interest rates anymore. They'll hold them steady for a while and then maybe lower them. And at that stage, the pent-up demand that has been built up by people sitting on the sidelines is going to come to the fore, and people are going to get back into the property market. And that's why I believe currently there's a window of opportunity for people who are cashed up, who've got a good job, whose finances are right, and who have a long-term view. Anyway, that was my long-winded introduction, and now let's have a chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson. You'll hear my Property Insider's YouTube chat with him. Let's hear what he has to say about all this. It's been an interesting week full of economic news. Firstly, the United States-US inflation figures, they spooked the markets as there's no sign that inflation is abating over there. Then back home, Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe warned that the deteriorating global economy would make it hard for Australia to achieve a soft landing due to the economic buffeting that's underway. At his annual appearance before the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics, Dr. Lowe explained that the Reserve Bank wouldn't be deterred from more interest rate rises, and he expressed his doubts that the current 3.5% unemployment figure could be maintained. He was also worried that businesses currently using inflation as a cover-up for even higher prices, which of course only pushes up inflation even more. And he gave some thoughts on the property market. He explained he wouldn't be surprised to see house prices fall 10% from their peak. And he also said the Reserve Bank isn't to blame for housing affordability issues. He blamed the choices made by society. Well, that's interesting, and there's lots to unpack from Governor Lowe's speech and other important property news that I'd like to discuss. So I'm looking forward to this week's Property Insider chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Australia's leading housing economist and chief economist of My Housing Markets. Hi, Andrew.
Yes, good morning, Michael, and certainly a comprehensive snapshot of what happened last week, and we've certainly got a lot to discuss.
Some would be suggesting the global signs aren't good. The outlook for house prices and shares seem to have worsened last week as interest rate expectations rose on the back of the economic problems in the United States, the high inflation that seems hard to budge, and in light of the Reserve Bank Governor Lowe indicating the Reserve Bank is going to keep raising interest rates because they're probably not at neutral levels yet. What are your thoughts on this, Andrew?
We've had some positive signs that Australia's inflation environment may be improving. It has, of course, been driven essentially by too much demand and not enough supply. We've seen individual factors in Australia contributing to that, and that has been firstly or primarily the sharp increase in house building costs as a result of the home builder policy last year from the previous government. We know that house building costs have increased by well over 20% over the past year. But the good news there, well, sort of good news, is that the rate of increase has now declined over the past 2 months. So even though there's still rising strongly, they're not rising as strongly as they did, Michael. So some signs there that all that development is being absorbed now, as it will, of course, over time. The conundrum is in I guess, a lot of instances that those that have purchased houses are being asked by builders to pay more because builders can't cover the extra costs. We're still seeing lower numbers of houses coming into the market in terms of building approvals. So once we do clear that backlog, we should get back to a more normalised environment in terms of building cost increases. So that's a positive going forward for the next inflation data, which is going to be very interesting because we've come to a whole new world now, finally joining the monthly inflation measure club, which everybody else does, but we're finally doing it. And just speaking about that, inflation data will be released in the third week of October, and that'll be for the September quarter. We will have a monthly inflation rate number for the first time, also the quarterly data. Not sure how that'll work its way into the narrative from the Reserve Bank for the November meeting, which obviously will be quite important. But the other factor is the price of oil. Price of oil is now fell to around about $80 US a barrel, showing some signs of moving back upwards, which is a bit of a concern. So the price of oil can be quite volatile, but in the shorter term, that has been good news for us at the Bowser. So that'll also factor its way into inflation. And that did work its way into a better result for the US on their August inflation numbers. But that was for headline inflation, which does take into account the price of oil. But their underlying inflation rate increased again, Michael, and that takes away the impact of volatile issues such as food and fuel. So they're very concerned about their outlook. And I think it's the point to the US versus Australia is that the US has very strong wages growth at the moment. It has a much more real-time response from wages to price changes, and workers have really been bidding up wages quite quickly in the US. And of course, that means they're out spending those wage increases, which is just fueling inflation. So inflation has moved from goods, particularly as a result of shortages through the stimulus period of COVID, and now it's moving into services, which reflects those higher wage costs. Now, we're not there yet, but there are some concerns that we're going to start fiddling with our wage setting system, which may see our inflationary outcomes move from goods to services, which would be very difficult to control, as the US is experiencing. Although it was interesting also, Michael, the US was confronted by a rail strike, or the potential of a rail strike, last week. So these are signs, of course, of workers getting a little edgy about high prices and wanting to be able to match them with higher wages. So the threat was for a strike from rail workers, which is the last thing the Biden government would have wanted with midterm elections just around the corner. So Biden actually worked as a mediator to solve that strike, but I'm not sure that the process of solving the strike have a very positive outcome for inflation, because those rail workers were given substantial wage rises, and that's likely to flow on through the economy. We're moving into that wages versus prices control environment now, which means that the outlook becomes even more clouded. So fingers crossed we don't start to get into that environment that the US is clearly suffering and pushing inflation up. But the good news, as you suggested, from the Reserve Bank Governor, is that perhaps revealing those factors we've just discussed, that interest rates might peak a little lower and a little earlier than expected. Those current 0.5% increases may not be what we can expect going forwards. But of course, as you suggest, the outlook is certainly clouded. And we do have the US that will make their interest rate decision this week, Michael. And some are saying that they'll almost now be forced to go up 1 full percent. And that's quite sobering, really, because the US has already had 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. This isn't going to help growth at all.
Well, Dr. Lowe suggested that real wages aren't going to go up for a while, that we are going to have to suffer some pain now, or the alternative is not to do anything and not counter inflation, and that's going to be a bigger problem. But he also gave some opinions on the property market. On the one hand, he said the Reserve Bank shouldn't be forecasting, and he's got into a bit of trouble over the last little while by making some forecasts and some suggestions which have been proven wrong. But one of them was that the property market could, and he said it's not a forecast, but it could drop 10% from its peaks.
If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you know what I'm saying? He said, he mentioned the number 10%, and then he said, but it's not a forecast. And it's a little different to when the Reserve Bank was mentioning 15% recently, and also said, well, that's not a forecast. So I'm not sure what's going on here. But of course, the minute the number's mentioned, it becomes a forecast. Let's look at the real situation now as we stand, and it's likely we'll see house prices down by they're down by around about 2% nationally at the moment, and that's capital city national median house prices, the weighted average, and it's down by around about 2% at the moment. So we've still got a bit of a way to go to fall by another 8%. Particularly given that we're seeing some just early signs, Michael. We've discussed this over recent weeks of the markets just maybe finding their way to the bottom, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And it's not just the fact that price declines are moderating, still falling, but not falling as fast. There's also some correlating data, such as auction clearance rates and days on market, that are pointing towards those larger markets, Melbourne and Sydney, which of course is really the national market, is basically Melbourne and Sydney, what happens there, that they may be starting to improve their lot. And we certainly have some way to go before we can call it, but the signs are positive there that they're having an improved spring market given the circumstances. So maybe the Reserve Bank Governor will make another non-forecast going forward of a little bit lower than his latest non-forecast that he produced last week.
Well, he also talked about how high house prices are, and it's not the Reserve Bank's fault. Now, I'd be interested on your thoughts in a moment on how high house prices really are, if they are high. But he said it's not about interest rates. It's about the choices we made as society that's given us higher house prices up. It's not the cost of construction, but it's really the cost of land and the fact that we've chosen to live in fantastic cities on the coast, and that we all want a block of land rather than high density. That all makes sense. We do live in the best place in the world, the best countries, and in coastal cities. It really isn't interest rates. There's a lot of other factors that affect house prices.
Well, the bottom line, of course, Michael, is I'm not sure we make choices is appropriately describing the environment. It's about certain areas make certain choices, and that's just a phenomenon of not in my backyard that is really consistent in most developed economies. Of course, as he suggested, it's not high prices everywhere. I question the whole notion of high, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the restrictions on planning certainly are part of that environment. The point is that local governments have control of land planning and state governments. So, of course, it becomes more of a localised scenario. But the maturing nature of Australia's urban environment is such now that people are making choices towards apartments, are moving away from larger houses. Society now has different work, recreation choices, and that's almost inevitably moving towards choices in favour of higher density away from low density. And that's just the evolution of the urban environment. And we're seeing that particularly in the shortages emerging now for apartments in a city, particularly areas such as Brisbane that are now embracing higher density inner city living. So look, there's a mixed bag in terms of the reasons for this. But when we get back to these statements of high prices, I mean, the Reserve Bank Governor's start to sound like a politician, Michael. I mean, where's his next gig? Is he looking to run for office somewhere?
Well, he may not have a job next year.
Well, yeah, we won't go into that. But certainly the whole notion of Australia having high prices is really a clickbait statement to a large degree. If we had high prices, surely we would have a sign of some sort of imbalance in the capacity of mortgage holders to hold on to their properties. But we still have record low levels of defaults and arrears. Really, defaults and arrears only rise as the economic cycle falls and unemployment rates rise. And it's because we have that very strong banking sector that doesn't allow us to overborrow. So prices are really a factor of those 80% LVRs and the 25% restriction on the proportion of our income that we can have as a repayment for our mortgage. So as long as those remain solidly intact, which they do, we can't notionally be over borrowing. So prices have a sort of a natural stabiliser, and prices will rise as the Reserve Bank changes interest rates, rise or fall, because the only thing that can change in terms of your borrowing capacity is your mortgage rate or your income. Now, incomes don't move as to the same substantial extent that or have the same impact that interest rates do, but certainly interest rates are an important driver of house price movements, particularly on the upside. But there's no doubt that, we have a shortage of houses in this country. You just have to look at the rental market, houses and apartments, to see that going through the roof. And getting back to the role of the Reserve Bank and others, similar policymakers in that particular decision, the Reserve Bank was part of the cheer squad that restricted finance to investors back in 2015-16. And now we're getting some sort of gobbledygook explanation as to why we have high rents and this notion of high house prices. Perhaps the Reserve Bank should forget about the dialogue and the narrative regarding Australia's housing markets and get on with the business of looking after the economy.
Well, also last week, the latest labour market data came out, and unsurprisingly, it remained consistent with a really tight labour market. But the headline said unemployment ticked up higher to 3.5%. Wow. But broadly, Australia's labour market's exceptionally tight, Andrew.
Yeah, fantastic result again, Michael. If you want a job, there's plenty out there. It's a very tight market. I think the interesting point with the latest data, Michael, was that the unemployment rate really ticked up as a result of the rise in the participation rate, whereas the previous month, we actually had our all-time low unemployment rate on the monthly basis, and that followed a fall in the participation rate. So I think we've now reached probably our baseline full employment number, because we just don't have the capacity to pull in, unless we start to really see some impact from migration. We just don't have the workers anymore. So we're going to see that the unemployment rate will rise and fall based on what's occurring with the participation rate. And of course, the whole plan of higher interest rates is to soften demand.
Well, what I also found interesting was that full-time employment jumped by close to 60,000 jobs, and there were fewer part-time jobs. So people are working longer hours, and it seems that taking time off for COVID and illness seems to be decreasing a bit as well.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be quibbling, Michael. These are great results, and we have a very strong economy. And that's probably one of the reasons why we're seeing housing markets stand up, despite all the usual clickbait of doom and gloom, and perhaps some of that came from the Reserve Bank Governor in his previous non-forecasts. Markets are turning over quite reasonably at the moment, particularly the big markets of Melbourne and Sydney that have led the charge downwards through winter with higher rates.
Well, one of the ways we keep a track of what's actually happening in the market rather than waiting to see house price statistics is seeing what happens each Saturday in the auction markets, because that's a real good indication of how people are feeling at the moment. And despite a lot more properties being on the market, particularly last weekend in Melbourne because of the Super Saturday before our grand final, auction clearance rates stood up very well, didn't they?
Well, they have, Michael. And speaking of Melbourne, they did have their Super Saturday, probably a little bit lower the numbers than we expected, but still well above the previous weekend. And the numbers were high. Let's not sort of quibble about that also, that auction numbers, nearly 900 auctions, is a good challenge for the market. And the market responded with a higher clearance rate. The Melbourne market has been particularly resilient through winter. It has tracked between the low to the mid-60s consistently. Now, that still represents what we'd probably still describe as a buyer's market. But once we get consistently at 65%, Michael, it is really probably the neutral zone in terms of housing market activity, where prices are generally not rising or falling. And our latest data is showing us that Melbourne house prices are not falling at the same level on a week-by-week basis, though they're improving, still falling. But now monthly price declines are looking like they're heading between 0 and 1%. That's a very solid result for Melbourne in this correction phase. And Sydney also, Michael, had another big weekend in terms of auction numbers, nearly 700 auctions, but it actually held its own, Michael, and recorded a 65% clearance rate. So again, the Sydney market's also consolidating to some degree in that sort of neutral zone. Now, early spring markets typically favour sellers, and clearance rates tend to fall as spring progresses. So it'll be interesting to see if that holds true going forward now, particularly in an environment where there's still a lot of negativity, where we will see interest rates continuing to increase. And look, the next few weekends, again, will be salient in terms of what's being revealed in the market. And next weekend, we'll probably have around 800 or 900 auctions in Sydney in its its Super Saturday, its first Super Saturday of the year. So that'll be, again, a big challenge for the Sydney market. And, if it can maintain another mid-60-ish type of result, I think we can really start to feel that these markets aren't as spooked as some would expect them to be. And the other smaller markets also produce some reasonably healthy results. And Brisbane's sort of back in town with a higher number of auctions and also a higher clearance rates. And Adelaide remains the top performer, still producing clearance rates around 80%, which is quite remarkable. And Canberra is certainly in pause mode at the moment.
I think, as we've said in previous weeks, the markets haven't bottomed, but they're searching for one. They're looking for one. They're not heading down fast, are they?
No, this isn't, at this stage, a rerun of 2018, when we had a similar sort of negative mindset and a lot of very concerning headlines at that time regarding the outlook for house prices. The market seems to be shrugging that off, and I think it's a factor in what is still a very, very strong economic environment out there, Michael. So at the end of the day, people are getting on with their lives, and perhaps they're a little bit immune to all the scaremongering that we had through COVID, and they're maybe starting to ignore what they're reading in the media to some degree.
Well, that would be good, because if history teaches us anything, it's that the media is consistently wrong. But unfortunately, our memories tend to be short, and that's why we get together each week here to give our thoughts and opinions on what's happening in the property market. So I look forward to catching up with you again next week, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks a lot.
In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. But before I do, I'd like to read out a review I recently received. Now, if you enjoy the show and you're getting some benefit from it, I'd love you to tell somebody else about it. Just share details about the show. Or you can leave a review, and Pan from New Zealand left a review on Apple Podcasts. And if I read out your review, as I'm about to for Pan, email me, michael@metropole.com.au, and I'd love to gift you one of my books as a way of saying thank you. Now, Pam said, "Hi, Michael. I love the very valuable content you come up with twice a week. I'm 31 years old who would like to get all this knowledge. And another thing, you have a brilliant fluency putting the show together." Well, thank you for those kind words. And I have a lot of fun putting this together, and I hope you're getting some benefit as well. I also hope you got some benefit from Dr. Wilson's thoughts, which, even though they were for Australia, some of it relates to New Zealand, and I know we have listeners all over the world. I can see where the downloads come from. But if you're in Australia, and if, like many property investors, you're wondering what's the right thing to do at present, let me just have a quick chat with you about that before the mindset moment, because, yes, as I've just explained, interest rates are going to go up a bit further, and it could eat into your cash flow and into property values. So you're probably wondering, should you buy, should you wait? Now, I don't know your specific circumstances, so I can't tell you what the right thing to do is. But I do know that moving forward, there are still some sections of our property market that are outperforming, and there are some underperformers, which means there are opportunities if you know where to look. And I also know that my team at Metropole can provide you with a time-tested, proven framework that I've fine-tuned over almost 5 decades. We've invested through times like this before. So if you're still interested in property, whether it's your home or an investment, your first investment, or if you're an experienced investor, why not have a look at how my team can help you? Why not organise a complimentary, obligation-free clarity consultation so we can discuss your options? Go to metropole.com.au, or I'll leave a link in the show notes. Find out what we do. And by the way, we don't sell property, so we'll start by putting a strategic plan together for you, or helping you discuss about your next home. And we've got buyer's agency, property management, wealth advisory, renovations, development, and even business advisory. Metropole.com.au. I'd love to be part of your ongoing wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to ask you a question. if you only had one day left in your life, what would you want to do with it? Now, too many people live a life according to the script that they didn't even write, only to discover the punchline too late. They say things like, I wish I had the courage to be my true self. I think that's one of the biggest regrets I've read that people have when they're dying. Other main regrets are, I wish I'd never worked so hard. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. Or I wish I had let myself be happier. Yes, we're all stressed at the moment, aren't we? Or I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. Often we're trapped working on other people's to-do lists that we never stop to connect with our soul and ask, what is it that we can't wait to do? Chasing dreams can feel intimidating, but nothing is as dreadful as living a life of regret. I see people all the time sacrificing their health for wealth. They spend their wealth then trying to regain their health. It's too hard. From now on, stop keeping score of the digits in your bank account and start chasing invaluable experiences and start making an impact. You are the author. You're the director. You're the hero of your story. At any moment, you've got the power to reprioritize and reinvent yourself. It's never too late. In fact, you'll never have more time than you've got right now. Live every day like it could be your last, because one day you'll be right. So, if today was your final day, what would you want to do the most? We're living in interesting times, aren't we? But twice a week I'll be back with the Michael Yardney podcast to help give you some clarity and direction. But if you've got some benefit from this, please help somebody else understand what's ahead. On every podcast app where you're listening to this, there's a share button. On iTunes, there's a couple of buttons down the bottom if you just press it and share it with somebody, or just tell somebody about the Michael Yardney podcast, or why not tell the world by leaving a review? I'd really, really appreciate that. Now, I'll be back again real soon, but you can catch me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney. And why not subscribe to my YouTube channel so you can get the regular weekly Property Insider chats with Andrew Wilson. Just look for Michael Yardney on YouTube or propertyinsiders.info. You can also join my private Facebook group. There's lots of places to find me. The Facebook group is Property Update Private Facebook Group. As I said, I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?